Welcome back, everybody. On behalf of the Russell Sage Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and Duke University, it's my honor to welcome Dean Freelon, who's a professor at UNC, and really just super cool to have him here for a number of reasons. Dean is one of the young stars in the field of communications, doing work that overlaps with computational social science. He's done a number of the first studies of the Arab Spring, of Black Lives Matter, and increasingly he's doing some new work on Russian misinformation spread, has a number of nice papers in a lot of different places, has a lot of interesting projects underway with Knight Foundation, and really the work spans both, again, academic journals, policy reports, and you know, also he's a heck of a coder too, if I can just embarrass him for a minute here too. So I don't have the title of your talk here. No, that's fine. This is a very seductive scene. Okay.
Give me 1 second. I will give that. There it is.
Surviving the post-API age. Okay, great. Very apropos. We've been talking about that very subject here this week. I would ask that people please hold their questions until after the after Dean's done. And I mentioned to Dean that we might get a few questions from the live stream. So without further ado, let me introduce Dean Freelon.
Great. Thanks. Surviving the post-API age. Colleagues, we stand on the brink of a new age, and let me tell you, it's a little scary. And it's a bit of a misnomer, I think, to call it a new age, because it's not so much new as it is newly salient, by which I mean that its implications have recently become obvious, whereas before it was the kind of thing that we could ignore a bit more easily than we can now. This afternoon, I want to give a broad overview of the key issues computational social scientists will have to face as we move throughout this post-API age. And so I'll talk about that for about 40 minutes or so, and then we can get into some Q&A. I'm really looking forward to that, or hopefully you'll raise some issues I haven't thought of to help me flesh out this general concept that I'm trying to develop. I also want to say at this point that although most of what I have to say will apply to those of you who are really interested in social media data, it's also relevant to other types of proprietary data, so you might want to pay attention even if social media isn't going to be one of your major data sources. All right, first thing we should talk about is what is the post-API age? Actually, before I really don't want to make any assumptions here. So how many of you know what an API is? Everybody, right? I was hoping to see most people's hands go up. How many of you have ever used an API? All right, good. How many of you have used an API within the last week? All right, there it is. That's what I thought I was going to see, at least half of you. So let me talk a little bit about the post API. I'm going to dip my toe into the humanities here for just a second. The post and post API should not be taken to imply that APIs are somehow gone or finished. Rather, you should think more of it the way that you think about the post in postmodern, right? So postmodernism did not immediately supplant modernism, but rather gradually permeated society as modernism ramped down. And so that sort of, it goes along with what you see here on the slide. I see a similar phenomenon in process, wherein with large-scale social media data, one in which a rapidly receding age of data plenitude, which I call the API age, helpfully, is being replaced by an age of restricted data access. Interestingly, the data itself is not really going anywhere. You can do whatever you want with it as long as you view it through a web browser. And so to paraphrase Coleridge, I told you I was going humanities for just a second, we're heading for a situation in which we'll have data everywhere, but not a drop to analyze. Thought of that myself. All right, so to give a more concrete sense of how the post-API age has evolved, I want to take a look at some of the major milestones in data access restriction over the past decade. This isn't an exhaustive list, of course, but these were the milestones that really popped out to me when I thought back over the past few years. And maybe some of you will remember these, especially some of the more recent ones. I'm not sure how long you've been doing this work, but this is certainly some interesting and very important history that you should know about as we move further into the post-API age. All right, so we're going to begin in March 2011, which is just after the peak of the Arab Spring, if you'll recall, when someone at Twitter, probably several someones, decided to prohibit Twitter researchers from sharing data sets publicly. Now, those of us who were conducting Twitter research at the time fondly remember an awkwardly named service called, I hate saying this, Twapperkeeper. Anybody remember Twapperkeeper with a W, Twapperkeeper? Before your time, maybe? So let me just tell you about Twapperkeeper. So Twapperkeeper was great. It allowed anyone to generate and save public Twitter data collection jobs. So in other words, you could type in a hashtag and start a data collection on any given day, and it was all public, so that somebody else, like if somebody had started a data collection a month ago for something you really wanted, you could just export that right then and there. It was awesome. But Twitter put a stop to that in March of 2011, and thus created the data collection regime we know today, wherein users can only buy or collect their own data individually, and the only data they can share is in the form of numerical Twitter IDs. Needless to say, obtaining Twitter data now is made much more difficult by that decision. All right, so let's fast forward a little over 4 years to April 2015. So before this time, you used to be able to query Facebook's Graph API and get public posts containing arbitrary keywords within a rolling 2-week window. Now, another funny story. Does anybody remember a sort of medium popular site called We Know What You're Doing? Anybody remember We Know What You're Doing? Nobody? So We Know What You're Doing. You actually, the site is down now. If you Google it, you can still see some news articles that were written about it way back in like 2012, 2013. Anyway, We Know What You're Doing was a website that used the Facebook API to expose embarrassing things that people said on Facebook. So they had 4 categories. Let's see if I can remember what they were. So one of them was people talking smack about their bosses. So I think the string match was like curse word and the word boss, right? So they had a list of swears and then boss. They had one about alcohol use. They had one about drug use. And then they had one about people's phone numbers. So if you said, oh, my phone number is this, then you'd publicly expose your phone number. And so it was all this sort of art project to kind of say, okay, look at all the data you're exposing inadvertently, and we're going to post it here. And they updated it every, like 30 minutes or something. So all that data was public, but Facebook shut it all down in April 2015, and that eliminated keyword-based access to machine-readable public posts. And so from that point, from April 2015 to April 2018, the only data you could get through Facebook's, or the only useful data you can get, well, it's probably a little bit debatable, but the main source of data that you could get between April 2015 and 2018 was through its Pages API, which meant that you couldn't get data from user profiles that were public, but only from public pages. All right, December 2015. This is great. I love this history lesson. Anybody remember Topsy? Who used Topsy? Okay, a couple of you remember Topsy. So Topsy was, and I think people don't remember this because now Twitter's search engine allows you to go back years. But for a long time, its search engine only lets you go back like a couple of weeks or something like that. And so back then, and I'm talking about 2013, 14, 15, Topsy was a Twitter search engine. It was really it was one of the only games in town that you could use to easily access old tweets. And so you type in something, you get tweets from years ago, and Topsy was kind of the way that you would do that. And even the people that remember that piece of Topsy, because that was its main public-facing service and it was also free, what few people remember, even the people who do remember Topsy, remember about it, is that it also offered an a la carte pay service where you could buy millions of tweets in bulk. Now, you can still do this from Twitter today, and I'll talk about their pay service in a little bit, but they do insist on approving your use case first, and so there's no guarantee that they'll actually sell you what you want, even if you have the money. Topsy was different, though. They didn't care what you were searching for. As long as you had the money, they would sell it to you. And so that was fantastic, right? And so unfortunately, they went away, and Apple actually bought Topsy in December of 2013, and Topsy shut down all of its public-facing services 2 years later in December 2015. All right. So now we're fast-forwarding to April 2018, so I'm assuming most of you remember what I'm going to talk about. And so in April of this year, Facebook sharply restricted access to its Pages API, which, as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, allows access to, or allowed rather, access to posts on public pages and comments. Now, contrary to some reports, they didn't completely shut the Pages API down. What they did was they cut app access to it. So, if you really want to, you can still use the Pages API with a user token. Unfortunately, user tokens only last 2 hours. So, and there's no automatic way of generating those. So, if you want 2 hours worth of data, you can do that. Or I guess theoretically, you could pay like some undergrad RAs to like sit there and generate another user token from the Graph Explorer and keep doing that. I don't really have the stomach for that, but you could do it if you wanted to. So what we have is a severely crippled Pages API that's probably useless for most types of large-scale research applications. And what that means is that the only officially sanctioned means of obtaining machine-readable Facebook data is through its new data sharing initiative, which you apparently heard about from Gary King this morning. Now, I also serve on the advisory committee. Obviously, Gary King is a little bit higher in the hierarchy than I am. But they haven't totally figured out what's going on with that. They don't know what form the data is going to take. Originally, they said that it was going to be like multiple CFPs. Now they're saying it's going to be one omnibus CFP. I'll learn about it when you do, I'm sure. Last one actually happened concurrently with the Facebook sort of curtailing its Pages API. It also eliminated Instagram's APIs for follower lists, relationships, and public comments. Now, they've also said that they'll eliminate the APIs for public content and basic profiles later this year and 2020, respectively. But for now, those latter two, the public content and basic profiles, have only been severely rate limited. So that's awesome. And so just like that, data that is here today is gone tomorrow, swept up in this case by the tide of the public outcry regarding the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Now, interestingly, these changes barely affect the public's interactions day to day with the platform at all, but they have a serious impact on computational researchers' ability to do their jobs, especially those who are interested in social media data. So, as the previous 5 slides have shown, the past decade has seen social media data access decrease progressively with no end in sight. And this is what I mean by this term, the post-API age. Now I want to discuss some of the key characteristics of the post-API age in comparison with the age that preceded with and overlaps with it, which I call, of course, the API age. And so the inspiration for this term came from my own personal sense as I became more reliant on APIs for my own research. The truth was always that Twitter and Facebook and the other services that offer these could restrict or cut access at any time. But I think during my pre-tenure period, which was 2011 to 2016, I felt that that was more of like a hypothetical danger than anything that might actually materialize. But as you can tell by the thrust of this presentation, I'm seriously reconsidering that position. Secondly, we used to have access to lots more kinds of data than we have now. So not only has the volume of data been circumscribed by rate limits and other means, we've also seen key categories of data disappear. And of course, that will have a disproportionate effect on some areas of data, some theoretical areas of research than others. And so some fields will feel this more so than others will. Access has also been getting more expensive. Many free options for obtaining Twitter data in particular have been eliminated, leaving costly alternatives available only to researchers with means, which is some of you in this room and not others, unfortunately. In the API age, anyone could obtain API credentials on demand and start collecting data within minutes, which was one of the cool things about it. Now, especially Facebook has erected procedural barriers to API and data access. Now, whether this is justified or not, it clearly makes researchers' jobs harder. Actually, Facebook has instituted a review process for its app credentials. I don't know any researcher who's actually cleared those. If anybody in the room has, please let me know what you said so I can say the same thing and get this access. Theoretically, I guess you could do this, and if you want to try it after this institute at some point, please let me know how that worked and whether they said yes or no. Relatedly, when API access was easy, it was also easy to follow the platform's terms of service. But more restrictions increases incentives for researchers to use data collection tools that are not terms of service compliant. And I'll spend some of the latter part of this presentation on an extended case study of one of those. And I'll try to give you some guidance in terms of when you might want to use that and when you might not necessarily want to do that. And finally, lastly, some of this data is just gone, right? It's just with no practical means of accessing them. And unfortunately, in many cases, there's just nothing we can do about that, right? So you can try to get it from other sources. You can try to look at this theoretically and try to figure out wherever else it is, but there's no guarantee of that. So, but some of you may want to do that if something that formerly existed now is no longer available to you. All right, so what do we do? Given everything I've said thus far, if you want to work with social media or other proprietary data, you have a choice to make. Every single one of you who works in this area will need to make this choice eventually, so I recommend you start thinking about it now. The choice is whether you want to play it by the book or off the grid. By the book pretty much means what you'd expect, right? Like following the rules and laws set by the platform and the locality where you work. And so that means you use APIs as intended, even though as I've shown, they're not quite as useful as they used to be in many cases. That, of course, makes you extremely vulnerable to changes in platform policy. A funny story again, this past January I was up at the University of Michigan. They had commissioned me to give a workshop on how to download, collect, and do some very, very basic analysis of Facebook data. So I went up there and I showed them how to do it. I did it all in R, even though I'm mostly a Python guy, which was at their request. And so the policy changes enacted by Facebook just 3 months later actually invalidated about half of what I told them. Fortunately, I had already deposited the honorarium at that point, so they couldn't take it back. But it was really unfortunate for them. Playing by the book puts you in full compliance with the platform's terms of service, which is good and bad for reasons that I've discussed, and I'll continue to do so. Based on your own sort of considerations and the kind of research you do, you may care more or less about that. Finally, and I don't want to overstate the likelihood of this at all, but playing by the book completely absolves you, or should completely absolve you, of legal liability as far as data collection is concerned. Now, when it comes to how you analyze it and how you store it, those are totally different stories. But as far as collections goes, you should be in the clear, legally speaking, as long as you follow this TOS. Now, let's move to the right-hand side of this chart and talk about going off the grid. Typically, gridless, as I'm calling them, researchers will use APIs less than folks who go by the book. Instead, they'll use tools that may or may not be officially sanctioned, and they'll do this because these tools are faster, more effective, and/or easier to use. This means that gridless users will typically be less vulnerable to the kinds of platform policy changes that strongly affect people who go by the book. Now, that's obviously a good thing from like a practical research perspective, but it's not all upside, as I'll discuss in more detail in a little bit. In many cases, but not necessarily always, gridless folks' data collection practices may run afoul of some platforms' terms of service. Now, that in turn may expose them to legal liability under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, or the CFAA, here in the United States. Now again, I want to stress this liability is at this point only theoretical. I don't know of any cases where researchers have been criminally prosecuted for breaking a social media company's terms of service. Now, the closest thing I can think of is the unfortunate case of Aaron Swartz, which, with which I'm guessing some of you may be familiar. I could talk about that during Q&A if you really want to know about it. But that was not a social media situation, and there were other extenuating factors that made his case a little bit different. At any rate, while it is unlikely that breaking terms of service will get you indicted, it's at least theoretically possible. There's a pending court case that deals exactly with this, and its outcome will, I think, hopefully settle some of these questions. More likely, the platform will do something like delete your account or ban your IP, which poses its own set of research barriers. Also better than prison, I want to say. All right. So let me just spend these next couple of slides running through a couple of recommendations and issues that you're going to run through if you work with this kind of data. And it'll help you choose whether you want to sort of, for any given project, whether you want to go by the book or go off the grid. The first suggestion, and this is only a suggestion, obviously, I can't tell you how to run your life, but this is a suggestion. If you can go by the book, do it. It sounds simple, right? Well, it turns out the word "can" is doing a lot of work here, right? So I'll give you a little bit of a story from my life. Anybody here have kids? kids? People have kids? A couple people have kids? Most not have kids. All right. So I have a 2.5-year-old. He's super cute. And this issue of what he can and can't do comes up all the time. Like when I ask him, he loves dessert, right? And so I ask him, I say, look, you have to eat your dinner for your dessert. And he's like, I can't wait until I eat my dinner to get my dessert. And so obviously he has a very different perspective on his own capacity to wait than I do. Right? So as computational researchers, to bring this back to like relevance, we're faced with a similar choice. If there's a if the by the book method is limited and cumbersome, and the off the grid method is like fast, easy, and effective, you just might be able to like convince yourself in your own head that you just can't get what you want either any other way, right? And so recognize when that's actually a real can't and when that's just a I don't feel like, right? And even if that's true, how badly do you really need to do the study anyway, as opposed to all the other studies you could do, right? And so what these questions point to in practice is an imperative to look for by the book solutions first before going off the grid, and secondly, to think of good justifications beforehand when somebody comes up to you and asks you, so why didn't you go by the book? Why did you use other methods? So you need to be thinking about this stuff in advance if you are going to go off the grid with this. All right. Issue number 2. Complying with terms of service does not necessarily mean respecting user privacy or safety, right? We should harbor no illusions that this is the case, right? Like HR departments, terms of service exist to protect the companies that created them and nothing more. Any protection of users is purely incidental, right? So in one sense, how much you care about respecting terms of service will closely correlate with how much you care about honoring the prerogatives of the social media companies that host the data you're trying to collect. Also, how much you care about the remote possibility that you might be prosecuted under the CFAA. Protecting users requires an entirely separate set of considerations that may or may not involve submitting your project to IRB. Of course, this implies, and this is really important, that choosing off-the-grid methods doesn't necessarily mean you're harming users, and choosing by-the-book methods doesn't necessarily mean that you're protecting them. It's very important to understand this. And the factors that should influence your choice of one or the other don't really have much to do directly with user-facing ethics. All right, issue number 3 of 3. Violating terms of service entails both legal and non-legal risks. I've alluded to this several times. I'm going to talk about it in a bit more detail. Should you ever find yourself confronted by the prospect of violating terms of service for your research, you need to be aware of the risks. And I'm going to be a little bit maximal in my talk of this, even when things are not necessarily very likely to happen. I do want to spell these out as clearly as I can because I don't want anybody's careers or livelihoods damaged due to ignorance about this. The risks of violating terms of service fall into 2 categories, legal and non-legal, not meaning like illegal, but meaning like not related to the legal domain. As I mentioned before, the legal risks are mostly theoretical, but they could lurch forward into reality at any point, just like data could disappear at any point, right? There are a number of legal theories that could be used in the prosecution of a case of a researcher who used software to, for example, scrape content from a social media platform from copyright to the CFAA. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so please take what I'm about to say accordingly, but both history and common sense suggest that social media companies probably won't sue researchers unless they inflict substantial damage on their platform or somehow degrade quality of service on a massive scale. But again, it's possible, so don't say nobody warned you. Aside from the legal risks, there are also a number of risks to consider that have nothing to do with the law. In my professional opinion, these are both less severe and more likely to ensue than the legal risks. I'm talking about the standard and often automated punishments platforms decide to mete out when they detect terms of service violations. The 2 main tactics here are account suspension and deletion and IP banning. A couple of weeks ago, I was at the annual meeting of the International Communications Association in Prague, lovely city by the way, and I had lunch with a computational guy who told me that Twitter once blocked his API credentials for a week because he had done something which the Twitter Terms of Service explicitly forbids, which is to use multiple sets of credentials sequentially to circumvent the limits on individual app IDs for data collection. So don't do what he did, otherwise you'll get your credentials suspended. Despite Google, and so to shift over to Google for just a little bit, despite its business being premised on scraping the entire web, Google forbids anyone else to scrape its content. And it auto-bans both humans and software that accesses pages too quickly. You may have seen this sometimes. If you click through Google Scholar too quick, you might see something like, hold on a second, please prove to us that you're an actual human with the CAPTCHA thing. Fortunately, those bans, in my experience, have only lasted for a few minutes. If you really test it, it might last for longer. But such delays may effectively prevent researchers from studying scraped Google data at scale. If you have to scrape it so slowly, I guess Google hopes that you'll just give up, if you have to collect it at such a slow pace. Now, these kinds of non-legal consequences don't threaten your freedom, but they might prevent you from collecting the data you want. And you should know that violating terms of service may subject you to these without any notice. Okay? All right. So, since we've established that it's safest to play by the book, let me go over some of the main by the book ways of collecting social media data. Some of these are platform specific, some of these aren't. Some of you may have heard of some of these, but I do want to just make sure everybody's on the same page with respect to how these operate and the advantages and disadvantages. And this will also help you to make the most informed decision about which way to go for any given project. I've already talked about API data collection, so I won't go over that again. But there are 3 other methods you should know about. First is analytics platforms, and there's tweet hydration, which is specific to Twitter, and then there's buying tweets, which is also specific to Twitter, but also has some analogs with other proprietary data as well. All right, so this is a bunch of analytics platforms. Most of the ones that we'll be talking about are in the social listening box, the social media analytics box, and the text analytics box there. Some of you may have used these. I know that there are at least a couple of institutions that have subscriptions to these. Some of the most used ones in my field are Sysomos, Radian 6, and Crimson Hexagon, which of course was started by Gary King. Since this institute is focused on teaching you all how to do most of what these services can do using like R and Python, I don't imagine you'll have much use for these personally, but I do want to talk about them because like your colleagues may ask you about these, and also for the sake of completeness. So the major advantage of analytics platforms is their ease of use, right? So you type in a few things, it's all WYSIWYG, point and click and all of that. And they're really good at generating, pretty charts pretty fast. But they do have 2 major downsides, which you probably can already guess. So one is that they're really, really expensive. So the highest quality ones can run you up to thousands of dollars per month, which is a lot. And that's like for like basic tier, right? So if you really, they're really geared toward corporate research, and so they have huge budgets to pay for this kind of stuff. Most academic departments aren't going to have that. So, that's one that's one disadvantage right off the gate. The other and probably more important disadvantage is that they're just not as flexible as what you can do with R and Python for free, right? So from my perspective, the only people who have any business using these are people with both, one, massive research budgets, and who really, really, really don't want to learn R or Python. And so I don't think that describes anybody in this room except for the massive budget thing. But it is important to just have like a general understanding of what these are and what their advantages and disadvantages are. Let me talk about tweet hydration for a second. So another way to get tweets specifically relies on a loophole in Twitter's data sharing prohibitions. It's not technically a loophole, but it kind of is. According to Twitter's terms of service, the only data we can share are unique tweet IDs and user IDs. A little known fact, actually I don't know how little known this is, but a fact I'll say about Twitter's API is that it allows you to obtain all relevant Twitter metadata as long as you have the ID. So my colleagues at the DocNow project, the guy who runs this is actually out of the University of Maryland, has created an archive of tweet ID data sets that you can download and hydrate. The term for tweet reconstitution is hydrate, independently. And so even though your hydration program will be subject to Twitter's rate limits, you just run it as long as it takes, and theoretically it gets like most of them. There's data attrition, which I'll talk about in a second. So for example, it says there's a Trump data set down here that has like almost 6 million tweets, and so theoretically, if you ran it pretty soon after this tweet collection was posted, you should be able to get most of those eventually. Where did my thing go? There it is. There are 2 main drawbacks to this approach. So first, you're limited to data sets that people thought to collect in advance. So in practice, what this means is you could end up finding data sets. You can often find data sets pertaining to major events. So if it's kind of thing, wow, Trump's election, or oh, Charlottesville, it's going to be on there. Lesser known topics are by definition less likely to be archived. The second problem is something called data attrition. And that is a problem that gets worse over time. In general, the longer the time differential between when the archive was created and when you hydrate it, the more tweets will be missing. And depending on the issue, this can be a real problem. A colleague recently told me that over 90% of the tweets that I collected during the Arab Spring are now gone as of 2018. So in some areas, this can really, really die off a lot. We're actually going to do a paper just on that like a sort of a tweet attrition of what kinds of tweets tend to die off, especially in sort of contentious political situations. So if you're going to do hydrating, it's best to do it as soon as possible after the event occurs and after the archive is posted. All right, last of three by the book data collection practices, buying tweets. And so you may remember a couple slides back when I was talking about Topsy, which is a wholesale, among other things, a wholesaler of Twitter data. 4 or 5 years ago, they actually weren't the only ones. You used to be able to buy Twitter from 3 or 4 different Twitter wholesalers. They all had like the Twitter seal of approval that allowed them to be wholesalers of this data. And some of them would add like proprietary metadata to like the stuff that came out of Twitter's fire hose, and you could do that. But Twitter actually bought the best of the wholesalers, a company called GNIP, and they took all of their data sales in-house, and they avoided all the licenses of the companies that were selling this data. And so buying tweets is probably the best way to get the most complete data available. But A, it's expensive. B, the format that they give you is extremely difficult to parse. What they do is they parse it into gzipped JSON files that represent 10-minute intervals of the entire time frame that you asked for. So for an entire year, you have all the 10-minute intervals for that year, and you have to download them all and then extract them. It's a lot. But the most annoying thing is that they insist on approving your data use case before they'll sell you the data. And so what's on this screen, if you can see this, is a segment of Twitter's use case approval form, right? And so you can see they've got what is the purpose of your product or service, what will you deliver to your customers, users and customers, how do you intend to analyze tweets, Twitter users with the content, how is your Twitter data displayed, do you plan to make an API available, will your product, service, or analysis make Twitter content or derived information available to a government or entity, et cetera? So they really bring you through the ringer, and this is not just a rubber stamp, right? They rejected one of my use cases a few years back. It was focused on international conflict, and that's something they really don't seem to like. I had another researcher colleague of mine at the University of Maryland who was trying to do research on the 43 Mexican students that were killed a couple of years ago, and Twitter wouldn't sell him data on that either. So there may be other topics that they don't want to sell data on as well, but I actually asked my data broker point blank if they could give me like a list of guidelines, and he said that's not public. So basically, he would rather make his job harder by have me ask him every single time whether this or that use case is approved, rather than saying, oh, we don't do X, Y, and Z, which doesn't make any sense to me, but by gum, every time I have the money, I will do it. So if you have money and Twitter's cool with it, you too can get your hands on the best tweets money can buy. All right, so we've gone over some major by-the-book data collections. And so now what I want to do is spend the next segment of the presentation focusing on a case study of an off-the-grid data collection program that may be of interest to some of you. Has anybody here heard of Twint? Who's Twint? One of you? OK. So for those of you who've never heard of it, Twint is a Python data collection module that was written by a self-employed security researcher named Cody Zacharias that uses a technique called asynchronous programming to extract Twitter data directly from the web very quickly. It doesn't use the Twitter API, so it can collect data continuously over arbitrarily long periods of time. Because it supports all of Twitter's standard search operators, as far as I can tell, you can pretty much retrieve any public Twitter data set you can think of, right? So in other words, the typical sort of data limits of, oh, it's beyond the 7-day rolling window, it's gone now, don't really apply. Sounds awesome, right? The only problem is Twitter explicitly prohibits web scraping in its terms of service. So what do we do? Before we get into that question, let's first take a look at some of the key differences between Twitter and its API competitors, the search and streaming APIs. And so some of you may know something about the difference between the search and streaming APIs, but for those that don't, let me briefly summarize how they work. The search API returns a subset of tweets posted within a rolling 7-day window based on keywords. Multiple studies have shown that search regularly excludes many tweets, especially for popular topics, and it also undercounts retweets. The streaming API allows for the prospective collection of tweets, again, based on keywords. The major difference from search is that you can only use streaming to collect data from the present point forward, and it doesn't support any historical data collection. Research has also found streaming results to be much more complete than search. So let's compare all three across the several critical dimensions here. Now, all three allow the use of keywords and usernames as search criteria, but only Twint can pull tweets from between two arbitrary dates, right? In fact, Twint is the only one of the three that allows data collection beyond the last 7 days, except for the thing where you can get the last 3,200 tweets from anybody's profile, but that's a variable amount of time you can get that data. And so in that respect, it's not constrained by time at all, where of course search has a rolling 7-day window and streaming only allows prospective collection. In terms of rate limits, Twint doesn't have any because it doesn't use the API. Search has a number of different rate limits based on what you're trying to collect, and the exact nature of the limits on streaming are not clear. A lot of people say that it's, oh, you hit that 1% limit and then it stops. There is no documented evidence of this on Twitter's website. I looked, and if I'm wrong, please let me know where it is, because I have not seen this actually. I've seen it in the literature, people talking about it, but I actually haven't seen where they say, once you hit 1%, then we don't give you any more. But empirically, researchers have figured out that streaming will tend to lose tweets during periods of high activity, but it'll collect almost all relevant tweets during periods of lower activity. In the last row, we see Twint's major limitation when it comes to data types. While none of the methods can get protected or deleted tweets, Twint in general does not collect retweets. The other two methods collect some, especially streaming, which collects a lot more retweets than search. However, you can collect retweets to Twint collected tweets after the fact using one of Twitter's many API endpoints, basically using the same hydration methods I showed you earlier with the DocNow data set. And so I can talk about how to do that during Q&A. So using those combined two data sets, you can get a lot of what the initial sweep with Twint misses. All right. So as I've shown, for many use cases, Twint will offer substantial advantages over Twitter's APIs. In fact, in some cases, there's no way to get certain kinds of data from Twitter's API, in which case something like Twint would be one of your only options. There are other programs that do similar things. Twint I've found to be the fastest and best. If you're thinking about using Twint, here are some things to keep in mind. So the first is that when you're thinking about those consequences that might ensue, the absence of an API means that banning accounts or credentials is not an option. So that would not be something that would happen to you because there's no API for you to have your credentials banned for. However, it could, at least in theory, ban your IP, right? So if it can see where you're coming from, and so if it sees a lot of abnormal activity, it could say, okay, we're just going to ban you. And that's one thing that can happen. Twitter could, and actually the third one is the one I actually think is probably most likely, and one that I'm really afraid of, because I've sort of tested Twint a little bit, and it's really, really cool, some of the stuff that it can do. But Twitter could ban the specific method that Twint uses to pull data. And one of the major reasons that would be really advantageous for them is that it would, with one fell swoop, eliminate all of the terms of service violating activity coming from users of Twint and similar services. So, and if let's say if this happens in a couple of years, if I've really built a really strong and sturdy workflow that's based on Twint, Twitter could just, take that bottom, brick out of the Jenga stack, and the whole thing comes crashing down, right? So there, you don't want to get into this kind of lock-in, right? That will expose you to those kinds of, and so that's one of those situations where if you are sort of an off-the-grid type person, your lock-in is not necessarily to an API or a terms of service compliant system. It's to something that the company can disable in one fell swoop. The last one, I'm going to get a little bit irresponsible here, but I sort of wanted to introduce this thought experiment about what if Twitter took the music industry's approach to Napster. Now, some of you might not be old enough to remember this, but back when I was an undergraduate, Napster, one of the things that the music industry did with Napster and some of the other file sharing services was they would, basically they would obtain IP addresses of people sharing files that were named for their intellectual property, songs that were popular in the era, I don't remember what they were. Anyway, so they would do that, and then they would contact the service provider. In some cases, they would subpoena them. In some cases, they would just ask and say, please give us the credentials of the people that are sharing this content. They are violating our intellectual property. And then what they would do is they would send that individual a letter that basically gave them the following choice. You can pay us $5,000 and swear up and down that you will never pirate music ever again. Or we can take you to court, at which you will be liable for $250,000 per infraction, which is the relief provided by the US Copyright Act. Needless to say, most people paid the $5,000. Again, I'm not saying Twitter's going to do this, but this is like in the back of my head thinking about some of these things that could ensue, especially if the court case doesn't go about people being able, or companies or organizations being able to count terms of service violations as violations of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. If that lawsuit doesn't go in the researcher's direction, in our direction, we might be subject to some of these sort of extreme legal remedies. So, but again, like in the future, but you want to imagine this before it actually happens, because it's one of these low probability, highly catastrophic things that happens. And so you want to be thinking about this in advance. All right, so I'm coming to my wrap up. Let me just review a few more things before I go to Q&A. 4 points. So first, as unlikely as it may seem, never forget that your data link may disappear without warning at any time. And so you need to be prepared for that possibility, especially if your data are proprietary. And being prepared means not getting locked into a single platform or data source. So there are a lot of researchers out there, I hope none of them are in this room, who have really hitched their wagons to Twitter really hard. So, but if they should happen to change their, mind about something, if they get their own little Cambridge Analytica, that could be a real problem, especially for folks that are pre-tenure. So do diversify your data sources because of that. Make sure you understand the implications of playing by the book and going off the grid. If something unexpected should happen, you at least want to have a good understanding of what the potential consequences could be. Just to have an advanced sense of that. Thirdly, and as I've mentioned, you don't need to be by the book or off the grid. It's not a personality trait, right? It's a per project decision that you need to make. I recommend doing an informal cost-benefit analysis when deciding which path to take given a particular project. And so your miles may vary, and you'll need to use your own domain-specific understanding of what you're working with to be able to make that determination. Finally, and I know I may have sounded a little intense at times in this presentation, but try to have a little fun when you're working on this, right? Don't lose sight of why you got interested in whatever it is you're studying in the first place. If I could sum up my overall message in just 2 words, it would be just be careful. Wait, that's 3 words, but you know what I mean. Anyway, so that is all I have to say. This is my contact information, and I look forward to discussing this further doing Q&A. So.
Cool, thank you very much. Okay, I'm sure we've got some questions in the room, and I'm not sure if we have any from the live stream. If you are in the room, just remember to be on the mic so that people following on the live stream can hear your question. Thanks.
Thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask a little bit more. You talked about the legal consequences of violating the terms of service, but have you found consequences for publishing? So, a case where you couldn't publish an article because the data you had wasn't legally obtained, or is that something we should be thinking about?
That is possible, but there are really easy ways to get around that, and probably the easiest way to get around it is just to submit to another journal where they don't ask those kinds of questions. So yeah, I mean, people ask remarkably. I found that especially with social media social media data, reviewers ask remarkably few questions about how the data was obtained. So they'll ask questions about the theory. Too many questions if you ask me, but they do that. Sometimes if you get some computationally inclined folks, they'll ask some questions about the methods. But I've never encountered that. But that's also because I try to play it by the book when I can. I have some data now that I guess technically violate the terms of service, but it's an extenuating case. This is data that come from Russian disinformation agents. And so I don't think anybody's going to slam me on that because the public importance of it is, I think, really manifest and doesn't really, it's sort of an edge case. And so I think in that case, I don't expect too much pushback on that. But yeah, I think that this is something that very few reviewers, in my experience, are attuned to. They don't ask about it. Although that may change in the future, of course, as this plays out and knowledge of this information and these situations end up sort of circulating.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I had a question. So when you work with kind of like off-the-grid tools like Twint, how can you convince yourself that it's capturing what it says it's capturing or it's doing what it says it's doing?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess that's more of a technical question. Well, Twint is actually nice because it has a couple of different functions that allow you to check it. So one thing you might want to do is, like a good example of this is if you're trying to collect all of the tweets from a given profile. It's got a couple of different methods to do that. One thing I did was I actually checked both methods. It turns out that the one that is not labeled as collecting all the stuff in the profile actually does a better job of doing that. So that's one thing you should do. I mean, like, even if you're sure that, so you have, if there are two methods of doing something, it's always important to like check both of them to see which one is better. Because it turns out the one that is labeled as though it looks like it might be the best way of collecting profile data is not actually the best way to do it. Aside from that, I would just I would put caveats in your research. So, one of the things I've used Twint or I'm using Twint currently to collect a bunch of reply data to several news accounts. I'm interested in what people are saying back to. This is one of my Knight Foundation projects. I'm looking into how people are talking to news outlets, and so I've got a bunch of tweets from them that I collected over a period of about a year and a half. And so I will have to acknowledge that I don't know how complete that is. I don't know what the biases are. But one thing I can say is that the data are very difficult to obtain any other way. And there's no a priori reason to believe or to understand that there's any bias to that. But one thing I would say is one thing that's really important to do is there have been several studies that have compared the search API and the streaming API. What somebody should do, so if somebody wants a really easy pub, what you could do is you could use Twint, basically compare Twint to search to streaming. And then just, and ideally if you have purchase data, that would be the fourth one to do. And do it all in the same data set and then see what the data loss is. And that would actually be a really, really big help procedurally. Wouldn't help you on the legal side, but in terms of the research method, it would be super helpful to do.
So I was wondering if you could speak to terms and conditions of websites that are not hosted in the US, and especially when they change from being hosted in the US to being hosted elsewhere. And I'm asking because I'm interested in how you dealt with that with the Russian data, which I can imagine is not hosted in US.
Yeah, well, a couple of different issues at hand there. So again, I wish I had somebody who knows a little bit more about the law than I do. And I know also that the GDPR in Europe may present a completely different legal regime than the CFAA does here in the States. And so a lot of this does have to do, with where you are when you do the research, as far as whether you're breaking the law and whether you're subjecting yourself to prosecution. Now, in the specific case of Twitter, all of the data that I'm looking at for this latest disinformation paper I'm working on come from Twitter. And so technically, the terms of service violation there is the fact that all of the disinformation data was gone by the time they announced who the handles were. So I make sort of a public interest argument, because this is something, meddling in, American elections. There's been a lot of media attention on it. That's something I'm willing to take the heat for. And so in other words, I have a off-the-grid justification in my pocket. When somebody says, "Oh, why you didn't do this? Why didn't you do this?" Because there's no other way to do it, and the public interest rationale is very strong here. Yeah, I think one thing to do is just to figure out what those terms of service actually are. So go through and read them, see whether they have any. A lot of terms of service, especially for smaller sites, don't really address scraping at all. So one thing to do is to say, well, does it address scraping? Does it explicitly prohibit it? You could sort of take the theory of, well, if it doesn't say you can't do it, then I'm going to do it. The other thing to do is to understand that Google, somebody who wrote about this, I'm spacing on who it was, but someone pointed out that scraping is the way that Google works, right? In other words, if Google can't scrape a site, it can't index it and it can't direct people to it. So you could also say, well, hey, if they allow Google to do it, then they'll allow me to do it. The last one, the thing to take account of is something called robots.txt. And so there's a little file sometimes, and you can actually see this on Google when you search the site. It'll say, this site's robots.txt doesn't allow any summary information about it. And if you see that, that is a good indication that that site doesn't want to be scraped. And so that would be something else you might look to in addition to the terms of service to try to get some idea of whether that site's owner is cool with you scraping their content. We have one over here.
Hi, thanks for your talk. So when it comes to buying tweets, right, you might have explained this before, but how specific can you sort of cherry pick what kind of tweets, or is it just some larger body of tweets that you pay for?
They have a lot of different search. Actually, if you go to their, I'm trying to think, like Twitter does this annoying thing where they sort of say, oh, you can get this, you can get that, but if you really want to know what all the search operators are, contact us and talk to us and do all this stuff. And so, but I actually, now that I think about it, I think that somewhere in Twitter's API documentation, they have a list of the premium operators that you can use. So what that means is you can segment by keyword, you can tell it if you want replies to particular tweets, you can give them a time frame within which, actually you have to give them a time frame within which you want the data. And yeah, I mean, I haven't really found any limits in terms of what I've been able to ask for. They give you have standard sort of logical operators, this, not that, or these two things together. You could phrase search, and you can do it over whatever time span that you want to do it. So I've not found a situation where they haven't been able to accommodate the specific logic of the search criteria that I'm looking for. But I do believe that in their API documentation, they have a list of the premium operators they do allow. Was there?
You can go first. Closer. All right, I'll go first. Hey, thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the desire to balance needs for replicability in the studies with the use of what might be proprietary data, such as things obtained for Twitter or other such formats.
Yeah, replicability is hard because, the DocNow project that I mentioned, that's an attempt to sort of put the data, it's attempted to be as open data as you can be with Twitter data because you can't put the full data out there, so you put the IDs out. But as I said, data attrition is a huge issue. So if I try to hydrate a data set today and I try to hydrate it again in a month, those data sets aren't going to be the same. Inevitably, well, if it's a large enough data set, if it's like 2 tweets, probably, it might be exactly the same. But if you've got millions of data points, inevitably some of those are just going to vanish because the account got suspended or somebody protected their account or they deleted their account or whatever. And so replicability is really hard, and it's really unfortunate with Twitter data that you're not able to share it. So in some ways, there's actually a conflict between replicability, which would entail, if you were going to share it with a researcher that was outside your research group, that would entail breaking Twitter's terms of service, with following the terms of service, which explicitly forbids such sharing. So on some level, again, when we talk about by the book and off the grid, you have to think about what you care about more, right? So in other words, are you cool passing people data under the table, as it were, typically what I've done, the way that I've solved this is first of all, I released the data, I released the IDs publicly for most of my projects. Well, for most of the really public-facing ones, I've done this, and I do the rest upon request. And then basically what I want to avoid is being in a situation where I'm handing out data under the table, people get word of it, and then they come to me and they're like, oh, we gave it to that guy, why don't you give it to me? So what I say is, look, here are the IDs, you can hydrate them, and I would suggest that you hydrate them as quickly as possible, because the longer you wait, the less data there's going to be. So that typically has been how I handle it, but the problem is you can't replicate unless you have the exact same data set, and Twitter expressly forbids sharing those, and so that's just the reality you have to live with. I mean, for other social media services, there could be other restrictions, but that's how it works for Twitter.
I have a question related to the sharing. So could you just talk about how you feel kind of about the ethics of people who might share under the table, or being on the other end of it, being someone who is taking data under the table or using data that someone's posted online that is supposed to be proprietary and that was not collected according to terms of service?
Oh, I don't care. I mean, it's not. I mean, I think as I phrased point 2 a while back, I mean, really this is just about the company's prerogatives, and the company Twitter's basic justification for disallowing this is that people need to be allowed to delete data as they see fit and not have that included if they've decided that they want to take it off of Twitter's platform. Which is an okay point as far as it goes. Because, but if you think about that from a research perspective, imagine that I do some research study that has a bunch of tweets in it. I publish it, it comes out as accepted, whatever. And then somebody deletes their tweets. My study's out there, there's no way they can get it out, right? So on some level, you have to accept that if you put something out there and people do research on it and it becomes part of a published research paper or book or product or whatever it is, and I'm just talking about aggregate data at this point. I'm not talking about quoting tweets, which I actually don't do. So that's one thing I really don't do is I don't quote tweets in my research. I will point to tweets. I've done that. but I don't like quoting tweets for that reason. I think Twitter's actually right there. But as far as aggregate data goes, yeah, I don't really care because like you're one data point among millions. The public isn't going to be able to see what your specific situation is. And yeah, I just don't think that there's any harm. I don't think anybody has shown that there's any harm from that. And so beyond that justification that Twitter itself has used for its data prohibitions in its terms of service, I don't really care about the rest of it. So if I heard about somebody doing that, I wouldn't narc on them or whatever, I guess whatever you would do. But I don't think that there is another pressing reason why that's a problem other than trying to stay in Twitter's good graces by not breaking its terms of service.
Hello. Okay. Also, sort of on the same point, I was digging through Twitter's TOS recently because we've got SICSS access, and there's a whole long section on how I'm supposed to go back through my own data set in the future and delete the things that have subsequently been deleted from Twitter. And there's a whole API to see if the stuff I've got has been deleted in the future. And like, as far as I can tell, no researcher has gone back and deleted the section of their data that like, and so to that extent, aren't we always in violation of TOS, right? Like, as far as there's, and what are the implications of that sort of? You
might not be able to tell, but I'm trying very hard not to laugh right now. Yes, they do ask you to do that. I've never done it. I don't know anybody who's ever done it. So. I mean, it's basically an impossible task, right? So because deletion is an action that can happen literally at any moment. So as far as I understand, the only way you would be able to do this would be to set up a script that continuously polls Twitter to check for deleted data, and that basically pulls the data out of your data set. So imagine like you're working on your data, and like in the middle of your analysis, you could have like little points of it just vanishing, just gone. Like it's impossible to do. So basically, what I don't understand is why Twitter would sell you a data set, whether through SICSS or through its own a la carte data sales division, and then insist that you do something that's basically impossible to do. So, like to me, that tells me that like Twitter is not like super serious about that, because like not only have I never done it, they've never asked. They never said, "Hey, have you deleted a lot of data?" And I'll be like, "Yeah, I'll get right on that," right? But no, I mean, it's so like they tell me up front, and I'm like, I'll do my best. And typically, what I try to do is I try to do my analyses, quickly. But after they're done, there's nothing I can do. But also, like, there's no public-facing data. So what does it really mean to take like a single point out of like a aggregate analysis that's millions of data points large, right? I mean, the practical effects of that are not only negligible to the people that are involved in it, but also to the researcher, except that it makes your job a lot harder. Like it's negligible to the output, but it's not negligible in terms of like the amount of effort it would actually take to do it. So given all of those things, it's not something I've spent a whole lot of time thinking about. And unless Twitter like starts policing that, which again seems equally impossible. If it's impossible for me to do it, it's impossible for them to police it. That's not something that I really spend a whole lot of like sleepless nights over. You know what I mean?
I guess just like, are there implications of that for the rest of the terms of service, right? Like if they have some clauses that are just like sort of patently ridiculous, and that we're always violating,
right?
And if no one's ever in perfect compliance,
right,
does that change how we think about compliance?
Well, see, here's what's funny, right? It's just like, it's just like law enforcement in general. Like some things are easy to police and other things are very hard to police, right? So like, drug use in your home, hard to police, right? Drug use in public, easy to police, right? So deleting your data in real time as people are deleting it from Twitter, hard to police. Like if you're overusing the API because you have like 20, API keys and you just keep using them in sequence, like Twitter can see that and they can shut you down. So I think really, if you want to think about this from like a purely practical perspective, you have to think about how easily they'll be able to perceive your TOS violations. And so the ones that are easy to perceive will probably be easier to enforce. The ones that are impossible to perceive will be impossible to enforce.
Do you know about the situation for Facebook data? So let's say I have a data set which only contains posts from public pages on Facebook. Am I allowed to share those in full detail?
That is a good question, and I don't know the answer to it. I'm pretty sure you can use it yourself, But I would go over, I mean, just for your own information, I would go over the Facebook's terms of service very, very carefully for that. Because, and what's hard about it is that Facebook's terms of service, actually Twitter's too, Twitter's is a little bit clearer, but Facebook's terms of service is explicitly written for like vendors, people who are in business. And so that's what's really hard. So, you know, it's actually funny. Ever since I got ever since I got tenure, I've been sort of a, you know, do it first and ask for permission later kind of guy. Like, funny how that works, right? So, I mean, but I would really go through and to say, like, look, I didn't see anything in Facebook's terms of service that explicitly, and like lawyers write this, right? So, if somebody can go through and say, okay, well, there it is, you know, section 3, you know, like article 2, whatever, there it is, can't do it. But if you go through it and you don't see anything against it, you know, I don't see why not.
Examples at the beginning of the talk showed a clear pattern in the social media space of declining data access.
Yep.
But in other parts of society, have you seen a sort of countervailing trend? Because you hear a lot about companies collecting data that want to monetize that data, and you can imagine that monetization could happen through APIs. And so you don't necessarily have free access through APIs, but you potentially have paid access through APIs.
Yeah, I actually would really love to hear about any data that anybody is using through paid APIs. One of the things I'm always looking for is I really want to create, like, actually this would probably be mostly discipline specific, but I'm sure people outside of communication and media research would want to do this. But just to create a list of places where you can get data either for free or for pay. So if you have data that's really interesting that touches on communication in any way, I'd love to hear about it, because I do know about there are some. One good one is Alexa sells data about website access that you can buy. There's some other ones. Some of those analytics platforms will actually sell you raw data. They won't sell you raw Twitter data because the Twitter terms of service forbids that. But well, actually, you can get you can get like 100,000 tweets a day or something like that, which is like a drop in the bucket for folks like us. So yeah, I would encourage like looking around for that kind of data. I don't know a whole lot about it. I think there's some ad data that you can buy out there on like advertising, web advertising, that kind of thing. But the idea is that it's mostly geared toward people in the industry. But depending on your research question, you might be able to repurpose that for your own research purposes. So absolutely, I think that's something that you may want to be very entrepreneurial about, trying to find those sources and trying to find out, one, the money to get it, and secondly, how that data can best be used for your own research purposes. Any questions from the Slack or whatever it is?
Do we have one over there? Is that okay?
No, I think that guy's just doing his hair.
I'll ask a question. So one of the things that's really great about this institute is we can put all these things out and shine sunlight on them. You know, like, so earlier last week, Matt, nicely laid out some ethical discussions and made the point that, we're all scared of this stuff. We all, should talk about it publicly. And so I really appreciate that your talk has done that for us here. These are things that, we earlier had a discussion when we talked about APIs, about some of these issues we didn't get into as many of the off the grid issues. And I really like that you've, nicely highlighted some of the dangers. Mm-hmm. And I think that, of course, the legal one is problematic for obvious reasons. The getting sued, nobody wants to get sued. Right. But I worry there's one more that's, I think maybe it was implicit in what you said, and maybe I'm sure you've thought about it already. But this Napster issue, right? What about our obligation to future generations of researchers, right? So, if we look back at the history of, these type of data disclosures, thinking about like who dropped the ball with the Cambridge Analytica papers, who, I remember once on Twitter, I don't know if maybe you were one of these people who was chastising this. I think it was a Danish researcher who had suddenly released all of OkCupid that I think it was a he that he had released. Mm-hmm. And many of us were like, whoa, there's all sorts of reasons you shouldn't do that. Mm-hmm. And there's legal reasons, there's financial reasons, there's, getting sued, by the way, might not just be losing money, but also losing your data, which for a lot of our younger scholars could be a dissertation ruining thing.
Yeah.
But what about, so I guess the big picture thing, what about our obligation to future generations of researchers? Do you worry about that? You said we're one Cambridge Analytica away from losing access to Twitter. That really gave me pause. I was like, wow, you may really be right about that. So what do we do?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. I mean, again, I see sort of a, I think I take it back to what I said before about Twitter really being right about, or having at least a kernel of a point about users' autonomy as far as with their data, And so I think there is a bit of a tension between data sharing that really enriches research and allows for replication. And on the other hand, but the more you share the data, that's where a lot of this sort of privacy anxiety comes from, right? I don't know whether you read this, but about a month or two ago, there was this sort of like, scary New York Times article where they're like, look at all these crazy researchers and all the data that they have, That reporter called me up before, and she kept trying to get me to say how much data and how many people have been affected by this. And I was like, I don't know. I mean, until Facebook shut the Pages API down, it was an open, flow. Anybody could have gotten that. I mean, who knows who had that data? And then that's only, the by the book stuff, right? That's not counting people who use all sorts of, unsanctioned scraping techniques or who use their own apps to be able to gain informed consent and all this. There's no way to estimate, how much is out there. And so, but anyway, the whole thrust of the piece, if you haven't read it, was basically like, look at all these scary researchers who have your data, and we don't know how much there is, and so it was really the framing of the piece was really, really not great. And so, but I think that there's but on the way to flip that is, wasn't it great for researchers because now you have the ability for folks to check each other, for folks to be able to apply their own algorithms to see whether the findings are actually true, whether somebody screwed something up in their code and they, which had huge downstream effects as far as like what the findings were. But it's really been difficult, at least in my own head, for me to resolve that contradiction because it seems to me the more you share that data, the more you sort of feed that New York Times like fear of all of this weird stuff going on that you don't know what's happening. I mean, whereas my argument is you really need to be paying attention to the corporations that are trying to earn money off of this because their incentives are a lot worse than ours are. But I do think that people get really nervous about this. And the more it gets out, the more we sort of edge, closer to if there's a public outcry about this, then that's how things get locked down. That's how Cambridge Analytica happened. And so, I mean, even though the practical impact of it was probably like not nearly as big as the research affecting policy changes that came out of it. So, I really invite your thoughts, everybody in this room, to how we could resolve that contradiction between increasing data sharing and respecting user autonomy and ownership of data, because it's hard to know what to do about that.
Deen, I think just to follow up on that point, do you think that there's a third point to that triangle? You have sort of you mentioned user autonomy,
right,
and then sharing of data for replicable social science. Do you think that the end of the age of the API will also exacerbate a sort of third point in this, what I think of this triangle, which is the status returns to access to proprietary data? So some people still get access inside these companies, and it seems to me that in some parts of social science we're in a strange place right now, where on the one hand we have a very strong and laudable move towards replication and replicability of analyses, combined with very strong returns to getting access to data nobody else has.
Right. Oh, that's a really, really good point. I'm glad you brought that up. As I said to somebody in the small group meeting earlier, I am really cautiously optimistic about what Facebook is doing around this, because they've got a couple of, I don't know how much Gary King talked about this, but they've got a couple of different models that they've talked about. One is, I think what Gary King probably spent most of his time talking about this morning, which is the application process. They've got a group of like 8 or 9 foundations that are going to be providing the actual money for funding the research itself, whereas Facebook will be providing the data. And so that actually is a positive move away from the way things used to be, which was it was official policy that you had to have a personal relationship with somebody at Facebook to be able to do anything other than the standard research that you could do coming out of the Pages API. I went to a thing at NYU last summer where they were like, yeah, you got to know somebody basically to do that. And so I think that the move away from, okay, I met somebody at a bar sometime and now we're doing research together, to, okay, it's an open proposal process that's helmed by your colleagues and operated out of the Social Science Research Council is a move in the positive direction. The other model that they talked about is taking some data sets and just opening them up totally without any application necessary. And so they've said that they're going to do this with a political ad database at one point. They haven't released it yet. They said they're going to do it. I think that's fantastic. I don't think that model is going to work with every kind of data. I think the reason why it works for political ads is because of the pressing public interest rationale there. But I do think that for the kinds of data that really works for, that's great. And I really, really hope that more social media, I actually hope that Facebook will serve as a model for that kind of research, because as much as they can do that, that is the way to go. Just put it out there, let anybody analyze it. It's all the same, it's not going away. And that is really how you get toward this. And it's so to whatever extent that privacy protections can be introduced, that is done. And so I think that to whatever extent that you can do that, that is the way to go. It's not going to be possible for all kinds of data sets, but for those that it is possible for, I think it should be done. For other kinds of data that are more sensitive, then I think that the application process is a good step away from the sort of personal relationship kind of thing, which really irked me because I'm an introvert and I don't really do that. So yeah, I think that's really good. And I think there's also just a broader rich get richer sort of, situation there as well, because it's the people, at the Dukes and the Princetons and the Yales and the Stanfords and the Harvards that are really going to get that kind of access. And the folks that, state schools like me are probably not going to be as close to the in club. It doesn't mean we don't have really cool research ideas and stuff to offer. It's just how those networks shake out. So yeah, I hope that other organizations and companies that have this data pursue those kinds of more open and I guess, for lack of a better term, meritocratic data access policies.
All right.
Nobody on Slack, really? I guess not.
Well, time frame, time differences, and
okay, that's fine.
But well, in that case, everybody, please join me in thanking Deen.